Be here now. Just be here now.
Welcome to the Road Home podcast with Ethan Nichtern. Join Ethan as he and his guests explore the Buddhist path as it relates to art, culture, activism, politics, Western psychology, and more. If you'd like to support Ethan's podcast, please visit BeHereNowNetwork.com/Ethan.
So hi everybody, this is Ethan Nichtern, and this is the Road Home podcast. Thanks so much for listening. It's been great to be back on the air. We have some great guests, authors and thinkers in the mindfulness and Dharmic spaces doing really cool applied stuff in upcoming episodes. And from time to time, like to share my own thoughts and sometimes lectures or Dharma talks that I've given. And so today's podcast is the recent lecture that I gave when offering for the second time that I've been able to do it, the Buddhist Refuge Vows, which is the formal step of a student actually entering the Buddhist path officially. As I said at various times, it's when a student stops being Buddhish and starts being Buddhist. It's a powerful step along a student's path. So this is from a time in October 2021 where a group of, I believe, 42 students officially took the refuge vows and really had a chance to talk about what it means to become a Buddhist and to take refuge in the three jewels of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. So we'll share that in a minute, and just wanted to offer, that maybe you're feeling, I don't know if you're feeling this way, but that it's time to go a little bit deeper in your contemplation, in your study, in your connection to teachings and practice on a regular basis. I'm always so fascinated these days by just how broad spread meditation is, the practice of mindfulness, all of the great apps that we have, the insight timers, the headspace, the calm, the 10% happier, which I think should be called 11% happier because it's real good stuff. But at a certain point, I think it's important to embrace where the practice of mindfulness actually comes from, the philosophy, the psychology, the ethics, the spirituality. It's a whole deep mode of practice and wisdom training. So just want to offer, if you're interested in looking into the yearlong Buddhist Studies program for 2022, that you can visit my website, ethannichtern.com, or you can go to dharmamoon.com, which is hosting the 40-week series, which will happen live on Monday nights starting in late January of 2022. Also everything is recorded if you have to miss class sessions in audio and video. Maybe you're feeling that way as we head into the holiday season, when people start to think, especially in a world that seems as on fire as our world, what to do next and how to go deeper and how to really have an intention for the new year. So just want to offer that you could check out the Buddhist Studies program if sort of this notion of like, how do I actually go deeper into my practice and study is resonating with you right now. And obviously there's many other options. But this is my podcast, so obviously going to tell you about the things that I'm up to. But one of the things I think we're dealing with right now is that the surface level interest in mindfulness, which is great, has really exploded. And at a certain point, it feels for a lot of us like it's time to go deeper. So that's what this talk is about, people who are really willing to make that committed step to their own path. And I hope you enjoy the talk. And I hope you're enjoying the podcast. Thanks so much for everybody who's reaching out and saying that they're really listening and connecting with the bi-weekly episodes. It's really heartwarming to hear, because I actually love, of all the things I do, I love this podcast. I love doing it. And please feel free to reach out. All right. So without further ado, here's my recent talk on taking refuge. A lot of this talk that I'm giving will be working with this notion of outer and inner refuge. And it's awesome to come together to explore the practice of taking refuge. It's a practice that's done in pretty much every Buddhist contemplative tradition. It's done differently. And tomorrow we have this ceremony that does come originally through the Tibetan heritage of the Kagyu tradition and Chogyam Trungpa formally taking the refuge vow, receiving a Dharma name. The idea of taking refuge, I think, is a very central premise of Buddhism. It doesn't just apply to a formal step of entering the path. And I think it's such an interesting analogy for entering a path, right? So when we become Buddhist, we take refuge. What an interesting turn of a phrase, and it has its historical origins in basically the way spiritual life was, more or less, in the time of Siddhartha Gautama, where more or less you had this culture where society was arranged in these small tribal city-states, and that was called the world, was these little regions of arranged society. And there was a strong spiritual life of people who had gone forth from the world into the wilderness and pursued different spiritual paths. So apparently it was common, when you're outside of society and there were different spiritual wanderers, to sort of greet each other by saying things like, who are you and whose Dharma do you follow? Meaning sort of like, what are you into? What spiritual tradition are you following out here in the wilderness, right? And so when the Buddha became awakened and started to build a community of practitioners, that idea of going for refuge was really about joining a community, right? Joining a path. And so this is kind of interesting, because the notion of taking refuge does bring up, and I've heard over the years many people talk about this as something that sort of scares us, the idea of joining something, right? We were kind of happy doing our thing in the spiritual wilderness, which might have been just in our case of a very highly organized yet chaotic society, stepping from path to path, going from workshop to workshop, checking out thing. And then there's this moment where you say, okay, I'm going to actually seek shelter. I'm going to seek a home somewhere, really. And it has this larger analogy of being in the kind of more cosmic sense of many lifetimes, supposedly, that we have each been a being of kind of wandering, not knowing where to land, right? And Mingyur Rinpoche in his article talks about this, that we look for home in all these places that just don't work out, And I know this experience very well. I'm sure a lot of you know this experience of what happens when a place we thought was home turns out to be impermanent or fleeting, right? Or doesn't even have to necessarily be a false home. It could be that it lasted for a while, but it wasn't going to provide true shelter when we look at what reality actually is. Right. So there is some quality of, and this is in the title of my overview book of Buddhism. This is kind of where that's coming from, of being a wanderer, right? Literally the Tibetan word for sentient being is drowa, and it has this sense of always on the go or wanderer, and there's all these turns of phrase in classical Buddhism about being wanderers on the path of existence and being kind of weary. You're sort of worn out. Nothing has worked out. That's the quality of sort of finding the Dharma. And you can kind of imagine, I mean, the Buddha's first Sangha, right, historically, kind of fascinating, right? Who became his first students? It was probably the 5 people who were the maddest at him, who he had earlier on his wandering journey as he was studying Dharma after Dharma, hopping from approach to approach, different meditative approaches, transcendentalist meditation, extreme ascetic practices. He had spent time with these 5 men who were doing these extreme ascetic practices, right? And the idea there was that this was a method for overcoming our wandering by denying oneself, right? Maybe if I can kind of take enough control of desire through self-denial, then I will kind of cease this always on the go mind that comes from endless desire. That was what they thought. And he eventually left. He thought the approach was too severe. He was emaciated. He was tired, and they were furious with him. And after about 7 weeks, dwelling in his supposedly finally awakened state, not really knowing what he was going to do, because he was at that point kind of at home everywhere, he encounters them again. And you can imagine it's actually such an amazing transformation that they became his first students and basically his senior students. And somehow they see that he, probably what they felt was that he seemed at home. He seemed to have found actual refuge, and then they started going to him for refuge. We want to study with you, right? We want to learn from you. We want to learn what you know. What is your Dharma? And we want to form a community, right? Sangha. So this idea of being in this kind of cosmic space of countless beings wandering, looking for that one spiritual approach, right? That one nugget, like that one Instagram post that really nails, oh, this is insight. I'm going to share this one. And nothing quite landing, and then finding a home in a practice tradition, finding a home in a very human practice tradition. So there is this idea in Buddhism that everybody is a refugee. Obviously, that's a difficult thing to say because privilege and social position in our world comes into play, which it was very much in play in Siddhartha Gautama's world with the caste system, and with his own privilege being from one of the 2 upper castes. But this, in an existential sense, in a spiritual sense, everybody is a refugee. We're all just kind of wandering, trying to figure out where to land. And so this is why, I think that the Buddhist politics around refugees in the modern world should be very simple. It would be you'd have to bend yourself over backwards to be a Buddhist and not support taking care of refugees, accepting refugees, giving refuge to those weary of wandering, wherever they come from. I do know a few Buddhists who bend over backwards, usually with some very convoluted argument about how it's those people's karma to be in their position. But this is really what Buddhism is about, is taking refuge and offering a kind of safe support system for awakening to occur. So part of this is like humbling ourselves to acknowledge, I've been wandering, and that's okay. And when you become a Buddhist, when you take refuge, it's not necessarily that existential dilemma of feeling unsettled, feeling not at home, feeling like things aren't working out, not knowing quite where to land. That doesn't go away. It just gives us a kind of structure of how to take up a path that we can actually come to feel at home within ourselves. Right? And that's this idea, and that's a practice that we can do every day. That's the 3 jewels are, I think, really are best used as just a kind of template for the 3 necessary components of any educational journey or path, any wisdom journey would have in some way these 3 components. And it's a good ongoing contemplation for each of us for like, how are these 3 elements coming up in our life? And the flip side is a really good contemplation. It's like, where am I taking refuge that isn't working? I think that's always, and Mingyur Rinpoche talks about that, right? We have our refuges, right, that aren't working, right? And when we get into the ethical discussion tomorrow morning, this will come up a little bit more. But what I really want to say about that, what the refuges that aren't working are basically the places we hide from the sort of discomfort required to awaken. Right? Now, I want to get away from any judgments about your refuges, right? Because it's interesting. I was thinking about like, what are my naughty refuges? Like my confused refuges, the refuges that don't help me awaken, right? And we all have the ones we're willing to share, and then we have the ones maybe that we're ashamed of, right? Some are outer, Netflix maybe, is a good example of that. Some are inner, right? Like sort of the stories I tell myself, right? About what reality is or who I am that are comfortable, but not actually awakened. Right. So you could think of whatever your confused refuges are, but there's no judgment. It's actually just a trial and error. There's this view of actually wanting to try and see what works to bring about well-being and happiness, right? And it's the same thing. You turn on Netflix. Nobody turns on Netflix because they want to like destroy their mind into some zombie haze. You turn on Netflix because you're like, oh, this is a really interesting cultural moment going on in front of me. This is amazing storytelling. Look at the cinematography here, right? Oh, I really respect this actor or actress's work, right? So it can start out feeling like an awakened place, and then there's something about the way we engage with the refuge that turns it into this like hiding place. And eventually the hiding places, this is the idea of what it really means to be a human being. The hiding places, they fall apart. They don't work. They are revealed to be more suffering, more dukkha. So what is it that Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha offer, and the Buddhist path offer? It doesn't provide, it does provide some level of comfort. It has to provide some level of safety, but it doesn't provide just a new hiding place, right? That would make it just a cult, basically. Like here, hide out in this story, like hide out in the story that the Buddha is going to save you. The Dharma is better than any other teaching anywhere. This Sangha is really going to be, these are going to be your people. They're not going to disappoint you. They're not going to be as annoying as that last community you were part of, right? That's not what's provided here. It's the idea. I love it the way Mingyur Rinpoche said it, is when we're on the Buddhist path, it provides tools to transform obstacles into opportunities. Tools to transform obstacles into opportunities. And that is, I think, what this structure of the three jewels, if it's not a hiding place, but it is a true refuge, is all about, we always have the approach when things go wrong, right? We always have the approach when things are not working well in our life, which, by the way, is a feature of the human realm, that things are not always, like, it doesn't all add up. You're never going to get it right as a human being. You can learn and do better, sure, but like, it's always going to be slightly broken, right? And so the three jewels, I think, provide this way of looking at, like, when things when difficulty arises, do I actually want to use the difficulty as a means to further my awakening? Do I actually want to turn it into a practice? And I think it's that actual transformation that makes a person a Buddhist. I mean, there's many different definitions of a Buddhist. The formal definition is one who has taken the refuge vow. So let's not get away from the formal definition. But what it really means is that a person who approaches the difficulties in life and says, let me use this. Let me actually use this to deepen my experience of what it means to be human, to deepen my compassion for myself and others, to awaken a little bit more, right? And that's really an indestructible approach, because if you take that approach, you are actually always at home. Like, the bus is late, let me use it, right? Because your other option is to just find the mode of transportation that always works, right? And there is no such thing. Or your other option is just to stand there pissed off because the bus is late. But with the Dharma at our side, the idea is that you actually use the dissatisfaction as a path. You turn it into a practice. You meet it, right? And so that's the idea, is turning obstacles into opportunities. That really, I think, is the meaning of the Buddhist path. It's the classic lemons into lemonade approach, right? So I want to talk a little bit about the inner and outer meaning of the three jewels. And we have this framework that Mingyur Rinpoche uses and others use of outer and inner. Sometimes in Buddhist teachings, there's also this third level, secret meaning. But outer really means the literal meaning of a teaching, and inner means sort of the essence, right? That doesn't necessarily have form or shape. So outer Buddha, right? On the outermost level, this actually means the historical Buddha. So I'm going to recommend, for those of you who really want to learn more about who he was, it's a very long book, but you only really have to read the first 250 or so pages, but you can read the whole thing. It's this book by Thich Nhat Hanh, Old Path, White Clouds, which is his very Thich Nhat Hanh style, extracted from a lot of the earliest Buddhist sources of the suttas and so forth, sort of biography of Siddhartha Gautama. And, for me personally, it's interesting because in some ways I feel kind of no connection to the Buddha. Like, my path feels very different time in history. His narrative is about leaving the world behind, we're avoiding the world to attain awakening. I think we really need to have more narratives now of like what awakening through embracing the world looks like. So there's some ways I don't always kind of identify with Siddhartha Gautama. And then there's some ways like just the unwillingness to accept partial answers to the questions of human existence, right? He wasn't, whatever is the opposite of half-assing your spirituality. I guess that would be whole-assing. Really, really completely investing oneself in their curiosity, in their investigation, in their pursuit of what they're looking for. In his case, the cessation of dissatisfaction, the understanding of where ignorance came from and how to uproot it. He really dove in, and it was all he was about. He was kind of singularly focused. And I think there's something so beautiful to look up to. But there's also kind of a binding factor here, which is that every Buddhist on the planet, whether they're projecting or not, whether it's turned into just a more propagandized image of a historical figure, feels a connection with this one person as a kind of originator of a contemplative tradition, right? So that's the most literal meaning of like kind of forming some kind of energetic relationship with a person who went all the way into their spiritual journey. A slightly less literal definition of outer is any example in a path that we're on of wisdom. Somebody we look up to is the Buddha principle, right? As whatever wisdom in the path we're trying to embody, we look to that being as like a mentor, a hero, somebody who actually knows more than us, you know? And I think we're in this really interesting historical moment where a lot of the hierarchies of why we look up to people are kind of collapsing. I think a lot of us, well, maybe they're not collapsing, but maybe our faith in them is collapsing, right? We realize we've empowered a lot of people for the wrong reasons, or who aren't upholding the kind of values, right? I think a lot of this is coming out of the Trump era, where it's just this sort of, you know, this is what a president looks like, you know? I mean, you could imagine Donald Trump becoming the Buddha next, right? Just sort of, it's just whoever can hold the seat of power gets to be the empowered figure, you know? So we live in this era where it's not so clear that we want to look up to people, right? And at the same time, it's so important to humble ourselves to the Buddha principle on an outer level of saying, you know what? I can't make up all of reality, you know? I can't figure everything out myself. I need mentors. I need heroes. I need beings whose wisdom I follow, right? This is the principle of taking refuge in the outer Buddha is like actually being willing to look up to examples of awakening. That doesn't mean it needs to be patriarchal or white supremacist or heteronormative examples, but it's we're actually willing to say the Buddha knew more about the mind, or teachers. It could also mean the teacher principle. Teachers know something I don't know, right? Just as an epidemiologist knows something we don't know about public health, right? You can't do your own research and get to where Dr. Fauci is. You need Dr. Fauci a little bit, right? We can't just figure out the nature of reality completely on our own. We have to humble ourselves to examples a little bit. And the counterbalance to that is the inner meaning of Buddha, which is Buddha nature, which is this idea that when we look to an example, what they're actually doing if it's verified in our own experience, because it has to be, is they are just reflecting back to us our own sense of knowing, our own sense of wisdom. So we need outer examples to reflect back to us the inner Buddha, right? And that go-between is really interesting to me, that go-between between humbling ourselves to examples, wisdom beings, mentors, humans who hold something for us and pass it down, pass it along out of compassion. And then at the same time, what they're passing down is something that's also innate to our own humanity, is such an important balance of humility and confidence. And in that balance, there's also this quality that to become a Buddhist is to, in the words of Chogyam Trungpa, it's a non-theistic tradition, which he was very careful to distinguish from atheism. Non-theistic means, in his words, nobody's going to save us. There is no savior. And the view is that a kind of spiritual tradition that's based on some external salvation is just going to eventually be a false refuge on the paths of existence, because it's not going to be revelatory. It's not going to help us activate our own innate knowing, our own innate wisdom and awakening. There has to be this balance between looking to others for wisdom and activating our own wisdom. And when we look to others, we can't look to them in a way that seeks salvation. We look to them to help us activate what is within us. So that's outer Buddha meeting inner Buddha. Outer Dharma, again, the most literal definition is we got to study the teachings and practice them. Got to meditate a little bit. That's another. So formal definition of a Buddhist is somebody who's taken refuge in the three jewels. I've also heard the joking definition that a Buddhist is either somebody who meditates or somebody who feels guilty because they haven't meditated recently. Right. So the outer Dharma is saying, like, let's actually practice and study. Let's actually be on a path, right? Let's actually be immersing ourselves in a body of teachings. One step less literally, it just means that we want to actually study and practice a body of teachings with curiosity, with respect, with intentionality. So anything we take up, right? Any journey or path, whether it's like writing, has a kind of lineage and a kind of path of practice and study that has to be respected, whether that's studying law, studying activism, studying dance. You know, I have always been a writer. It's the thing that I wanted to be since I was very little. And I often tell this story that the poet Allen Ginsberg was a student of Chogyam Trungpa. So he was in the same New York community of the Tibetan Buddhist Sangha that my parents were part of. So I met him a number of times as a child, not really knowing who he was. But one time he arranged for like 5 or 6 kids who were in the Sangha to go to his apartment in the East Village. I think I was like 9 years old for a poetry lesson, you know, and I don't really remember much that happened other than him just encouraging us to write. I remember the toilet in his apartment had one of those pull chains above, very, very old school Manhattan tenement style. But there's some energetic sense that might be a projection because it was Allen Ginsberg. And later I figured out who that actually was and how lucky I had been or a projection because he was a Buddhist and in the same Buddhist lineage, but some idea of like actually passing on a Dharma of writing, right? And actually, so the idea of being a Buddhist is when you study any Dharma, you respect it. You actually want to be a good student of whatever you take on as a Buddhist. The taking refuge in the Dharma is taking refuge in the Buddha Dharma for sure, but everything becomes something to be practiced and studied with respect, right? And the inner Dharma is that it's really about, again, same thing. It's about unlocking your own insight. It's about taking on anything as a path of study and having that genuine respect for it. And it's also about unveiling your own Dharma, you know? As you study Buddhism, I've had this experience. Sometimes I'm like, yeah, that word that all the translators use, you know, doesn't really work, you know. It's maybe with my experience, I'd say this other word is true, you know. And so we get to develop our own experience of the teachings, and we begin to express the teachings through our own language as we gain more and more confidence with them. And we begin to infuse other bodies of knowledge. Everybody here has other bodies of knowledge that you practice, maybe that you've even mastered or semi-mastered. And those also get infused with the same view of the Dharma, right? Of being Dharma and being dharmically pursued. So the third refuge is Sangha, community. Often this is where jokes usually go in about how this is the hardest of the three. Certainly now during the pandemic, this is the one that when I'm working with students get the most sort of lamenting questions about how do we establish this? It takes work. It takes effort. You know, we're establishing a Sangha for just this period of time, this night and full day. So on the outermost level, what Sangha means is the community who is practicing the Dharma with you. In other words, they are studying the same teachings and practicing the same teachings with you, and they can form a kind of support and a kind of feedback, positive feedback structure for your path, you know? I mean, this very simple wisdom is if you want to maintain people ask like, what should I do if I want to maintain a meditation practice? You can work with all of the different rules of habit forming, etc. You can read all those good psychological articles about how to form good habits. And there is some discipline involved. But the best way to sustain a meditation practice is to have friends who meditate and check in with them about it. Something about the relational nature of the human mind and our human experience is in this third refuge, right? And I think at least the Buddha was getting over his kind of avoidant attachment style to realize if we can get because he didn't have this when he was pursuing awakening, but if groups of people can come together and practice and support each other's ethical practices, support each other's good choices, it makes the whole thing easier, right? So the outermost meaning of Sangha is those who are doing the same practices we are and that we're in contact with. We have formed a community. I think another outer meaning of Sangha, again, going one step less literal, is those who support our practice, you know, those who at least, you know, give us good habits and support and love so that when we try to practice, we can do it, all of us. I personally think it's actually really important as a Buddhist and to have friends in my life who are not Buddhists, who don't really care, who care about me, but we can meet in other languages. We can discuss and share other dharmas, just so one of the reasons that's important is because you don't want to get too insular in your experience as a Buddhist. And two, I don't want to lose my ability to talk to humans, and interact with real humans. So it's good to have friendships that are supportive friendships, but that are outside of the formal sanghas of practitioners that you might interact with. And then, the way I think of inner sangha is, the number one thing that comes to mind when I think of inner sangha is our ancestors, right? Our kind of ancestral lineages, our family history, our cultural ancestry, the lineages of whatever wisdom traditions we hold that sort of form this inner support structure. I think it's very important because meditation practice specifically can be such a, maybe not lonely, but an alone pursuit a lot of the time. And we really recognize through doing it that we can't exactly share our experience fully with others. That's part of being on this path, is kind of our recognition and turning from a kind of feeling of insufficiency into a sense of strength, our experience of being alone. And so because there is a lot of this path that is about learning to be more alone with ourselves, the kind of inner sangha where we can call on our ancestors or our dharma protectors or the bodhisattvas like Tara and Manjushri, who maybe kind of just exist in a kind of psychological or energetic realm, becomes really important to feel like we have that support, to feel like we actually have a kind of strong community within us. So that's the way I think of inner sangha, as being our ancestors and all of the protector beings that we can call on to aid our practice, to aid our awakening. But if that's too woo for you, let's focus on the outer sangha. Find friends who meditate and check in with them regularly. Right? And that's the number one way to build discipline in your own practice. And then also, there is, and I think, again, we'll get into this when we get into the refraining practices of ethics tomorrow. There is a chance here to look at the sanghas that we partake in that take us away from awakening, right? And again, this is not somebody saying, don't hang out with those people over there. This is us kind of checking in and saying, who am I hanging out with? Who am I spending my time with? And how does it actually further the development of my human qualities? Who are my sangha right now, and how does that help me move along my path? Yeah, so Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, right? I take refuge in the Buddha, the example. I take refuge in the Dharma, the teachings. I take refuge in the Sangha, the companions along the path. And this is formally what we will recite in the vow ceremony. The example, the teachings, the companions along the path. Those are the three refuges. And it's also a good chance to look at, as you're saying, that almost like the bizarro version of those. Like, who are the examples we followed in our life that were not wakeful, right? What teachings did we follow that were false refuges, right? When were we in Sangha in ways that did not help, that actually took us deeper into our dissatisfaction, our stuckness, our self-aggression, etc.?